November 27, 1932, Gerasimovka, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, Ukrainian SSR. The village lay beneath a sky the color of old steel, the kind of cold, low-hanging overcast that seems to press down on the earth itself. Smoke rose in thin apologetic columns from chimneys scattered across the landscape, where wooden houses crouched in rows like penitents awaiting judgment. The fields beyond stretched vast and empty, stripped of their harvest months earlier, now dusted with the season's first snow. This was the heartland of the Ukrainian breadbasket, though bread had become a memory here, a word spoken in whispers behind closed doors. In the central square, a banner hung between two poles, its red fabric dulled by weather, but its message still legible in block Cyrillic letters. Those who do not work, do not eat. Nearby stood a wooden platform, where party officials sometimes addressed the collective farm workers. Though recently the speeches had grown shorter and the crowds thinner, the platform was empty now, but the presence of authority lingered in the air like the smell of burning straw. Inside a modest dwelling on the village's eastern edge, the Morozov family prepared for their evening meal. The house was typical of the region, log walls chinked with clay, a single room divided by curtains, an iron stove that served as the heart of domestic life. Trofim Morozov, the father, sat at a rough wooden table, his hands dark with the permanent stain of farm work. His wife, Tatyana, moved between the stove and the table with the mechanical efficiency of someone conserving energy. Their eldest son, Pavlik, 13 years old, sat across from his father, watching. The boy had changed in recent months. His teachers at the village school had noticed it first, an intensity in his gaze during political lessons, a fervor when discussing the 5-year plan or the Kulak menace. He had joined the young pioneers that spring, and the red neckerchief he wore had become, for him, more than mere fabric. It was a banner, a declaration, a boundary line between the world of the past and the glorious future promised by the party, between his parents' generation and his own. The grain collection quota has been raised again, Trofim said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice carried neither anger nor resignation, just the flat acknowledgement of fact that characterized those who had learned not to fight the inevitable. They say by morning, every household must deliver another 2 poods to the collection point. Tatyana's hands paused over the pot. We have nothing left to give. Then we must find something. Pavlik looked from his father to his mother, his young face unreadable in the dim light cast by a single kerosene lamp. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, carrying with it the distant sound of a dog barking, and then falling silent. This was the world into which ideology had descended like a second winter, colder and more permanent than any season. This was a landscape where loyalty would be tested, where the personal would collide catastrophically with the political, where a boy's faith in the future would destroy the past that had given him birth. This is the story of how Pavlik Morozov became the Soviet Union's most celebrated child hero, and how that celebration was built on the graves of his own parents. To understand the events that unfolded in Gerasimovka, one must first comprehend the vast transformation sweeping across the Soviet Union in those years, a revolution within the revolution, an upheaval so profound that it would reshape not only the economy and agriculture of the world's largest nation, but the very psychology of its people. Joseph Stalin's first 5-year plan, launched in 1928, represented an attempt to catapult a predominantly agricultural society into the industrial age within a single generation. Factories rose from frozen ground. Cities swelled with peasants torn from ancestral villages. Production quotas became sacred texts, and their fulfillment, or failure to fulfill them, carried consequences measured in survival or starvation, freedom or imprisonment, life or death. Parallel to industrialization came collectivization, perhaps the most traumatic social engineering project in human history. Private farming, which had sustained Russian peasant families for centuries, was to be abolished. Individual plots would be consolidated into vast collective farms, or kolkhozes, where the land belonged to everyone and therefore to no one, where production would be planned by distant bureaucrats and mechanized by tractors that rarely arrived or frequently broke down. The kulaks, prosperous peasants who owned their land and employed hired labor, were designated as class enemies, obstacles to socialist progress. The definition of kulak, however, proved elastic. In practice, it could mean anyone who resisted collectivization, anyone who hoarded grain, anyone denounced by a neighbor or party activist. The dekulakization campaign that swept the countryside in 1930 and 1931 saw millions of families dispossessed, exiled to Siberia, or executed. Their property was seized. Their names were erased from village rolls. They became non-persons, ghosts of the old order. The party required vigilance. It demanded that Soviet citizens, especially the young, place loyalty to the state above all other bonds, above friendship, above family, above the ancient ties of blood and kinship that had once defined community. The schools became factories for producing new Soviet men and women, children who would see the world through the lens of class struggle, who would understand that the private sphere must bow before the collective good, who would recognize enemies of the people, even, perhaps especially, within their own households. The Young Pioneers, founded in 1922, served as the primary vehicle for this ideological formation. Children as young as 9 wore the red neckerchief and learned songs praising Lenin and Stalin. They studied the pioneers' motto, always ready. They participated in public demonstrations, helped with grain collection, and most importantly, they learned to watch and to report. The pioneer organization emphasized that a true Soviet child owed allegiance not to parents but to the party, not to tradition but to the revolutionary future. In this context, denunciation became a civic duty. The Soviet state relied on a vast network of informers, neighbors reporting on neighbors, workers on fellow workers, children on parents. The OGPU, the secret police force that preceded the NKVD, maintained files on millions of citizens. A single anonymous letter could trigger an investigation. A casual comment, overheard and reported, could lead to arrest. The line between private conversation and public crime dissolved. By 1932, the consequences of these policies had become catastrophic in Ukraine and other grain-producing regions. The state's insatiable demand for grain to feed industrial workers and to export for foreign currency, combined with resistance to collectivization and poor harvests, produced famine conditions. The Holodomor, as it would later be called, killed millions, villages emptied, bodies lay unburied in fields, families consumed anything that might provide nutrition, grass, tree bark, leather, things that should not be spoken. Yet the official narrative permitted no acknowledgement of failure. The party line insisted that wreckers and saboteurs, kulaks, and counter-revolutionaries were responsible for any difficulties. The solution to hunger was not less grain extraction, but more vigilance, more class warfare, more ruthless elimination of enemies within. Into this world of hunger and suspicion, propaganda and purges, Pavlik Morozov would step, carrying the lessons he had learned in school and in the Young Pioneers. He would become the ideal that the regime sought to create. A child who placed ideology above family, who saw his father not as a parent but as an enemy of the people, who demonstrated the ultimate revolutionary virtue, the willingness to sacrifice everything, even those closest to him, for the cause. The transformation of Pavel Trofimovich Morozov from ordinary village boy to pioneer zealot did not happen overnight. It emerged gradually, through the accumulation of lessons and experiences that shaped his understanding of the world and his place within it. The Gerasimovka village school occupied a converted church building, its dome removed and replaced with a simple peaked roof, its icons long since destroyed or hidden away. Inside, portraits of Lenin and Stalin gazed down from walls where saints had once presided. The teacher, a young woman named Yelena Fyodorova, had been sent from the city with instructions to modernize the curriculum and eliminate superstitious thinking. Pavlik proved to be an attentive student, particularly during political lessons. When Comrade Fyodorova explained the theory of class struggle, he listened with an intensity that bordered on hunger. When she described the kulak menace, how these rural exploiters hoarded grain while workers starved, how they sabotaged collective farms and spread counter-revolutionary propaganda, his jaw tightened with righteous anger. The kulaks are like parasites, Comrade Fyodorova said one afternoon in March, her voice carrying to every corner of the drafty classroom. They fatten themselves on the labor of others. They hide grain in underground pits, while children go hungry. They pretend to support Soviet power, while secretly working to restore the old order of landlords and capitalists. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the rows of students. But we have weapons against them. We have vigilance. We have consciousness. We have the understanding that class enemies must be exposed and eliminated, no matter where they hide. Even, and here she paused for emphasis, even if they hide within our own families. The students shifted uncomfortably. This was dangerous territory, challenging loyalties that ran deeper than politics. The young pioneers understand this principle. Comrade Fyodorova continued, a true pioneer's first loyalty is to the revolution, to the working class, to the Soviet motherland. All other loyalties are secondary. This is not cruelty. This is wisdom. This is the price of building a new world. Pavlik absorbed these lessons with the fervor of a convert. At home, he began to watch his father with new eyes. Pavlik Morozov was chairman of the village Soviet, a position of modest authority that involved mediating disputes and overseeing the implementation of party directives. But Pavlik noticed things that troubled him. Private conversations with other peasants that ended when he approached, trips to the fields at odd hours, a general air of evasion when discussing the grain collection quotas. The village itself was changing. The collective farm, established the previous year amid considerable resistance, functioned poorly. Equipment broke down. Draft animals died from overwork or lack of fodder. The grain quotas set by distant planners bore no relationship to actual yields. Peasants who had worked the same land for generations found themselves taking orders from party appointees who knew agriculture only from textbooks. In this environment, survival increasingly depended on cunning. Peasants hid portions of the harvest before the collection teams arrived. They falsified reports. They bribed officials. They did what human beings have always done when confronted with impossible demands. They bent the rules. They lied. They protected their own. Pavlik Morozov was not a political man. He had supported the revolution in 1917, hoping it would bring land to the landless. He had served in the Red Army during the Civil War, but the new policies bewildered him. The state demanded quantities of grain that did not exist. Children were going hungry. Old people were dying. And yet the quotas kept rising, the pressure kept intensifying, the accusations of sabotage kept multiplying. He began, cautiously, to issue false documents to certain families, allowing them to keep grain for survival. He signed papers indicating that grain had been delivered when it had not. These were small acts of mercy in his eyes, modest attempts to prevent catastrophe. In the eyes of the state, they constituted counter-revolutionary sabotage, aiding kulak elements, obstructing the grain collection campaign. Pavlik noticed his father's deceptions. At first, he said nothing, caught between loyalty to family and loyalty to the principles he was learning at school. But the tension grew. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable. His father was engaging in precisely the kind of behavior that Comrade Fyodorova had described, hiding grain, protecting kulaks, undermining Soviet power. The boy faced a choice. He could remain silent, complicit in counter-revolutionary activity, betraying everything he had come to believe. Or he could act according to his principles, fulfilling his duty as a young pioneer, demonstrating his loyalty to the cause. In the dialectic of Stalin's Russia, there was no middle ground. The summer of 1932 brought neither relief nor respite to the villages of Ukraine. The harvest came in poor, weakened by drought and disorganization. Yet the state's appetite for grain only intensified. Stalin had declared that the grain procurement campaign must succeed at any cost. Local party officials, themselves subject to quotas and threats, pressured village leaders with increasing desperation. The OGPU established checkpoints to prevent peasants from leaving their villages in search of food. Anyone caught with unauthorized grain could be arrested as a hoarder or speculator. In Gerasimovka, tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. The collective farm's chairman had been replaced twice already that year, each successor proving either incompetent or unable to meet the impossible demands placed upon him. Trofim Morozov, as village Soviet chairman, found himself caught between the peasants who pleaded for survival and the district authorities who demanded results. On August 14th, a confrontation occurred that would set in motion the final tragedy. A team of grain collectors arrived from the district center, accompanied by OGPU officers. They conducted a search of several households suspected of hoarding. In one home, they discovered a hidden cache of wheat, perhaps 40 pounds, enough to keep a family alive for a few weeks. The family patriarch was arrested on the spot. His wife and children watched as he was led away, hands bound, toward an uncertain fate. That evening, Pavlik overheard an argument between his parents. Through the thin curtain dividing the room, he listened as his mother pleaded with his father. "You're protecting the wrong people, Trofim. The kulaks will destroy us all with their selfishness. They're not kulaks."
"Tatyana, they're our neighbors. They're starving.
"And what about our children? What happens when the OGPU discovers what you've been doing?
What happens to Pavlik and his brother then? I won't let children starve because of numbers on paper written by men who've never worked a field in their lives."
"You're a fool. The party is killing us." The words hung in the air, dangerous and irrevocable. Pavlik felt his heart pounding. His father had spoken against the party. His father was by definition an enemy of the people. The boy did not sleep that night. He lay on his wooden cot, the red neckerchief folded carefully beside him, and considered his options. Comrade Fyodorov's words echoed in his mind. "Even if they hide within our own families." The young pioneer's code was clear: report all counter-revolutionary activity, regardless of the source. But this was his father, the man who had taught him to fish in the river, who had carried him on his shoulders when he was small, who worked until his hands bled to provide for the family. How could he betray that? How could he destroy the man who had given him life? Yet his father was protecting kulaks, falsifying documents, undermining the grain collection campaign. His father was, objectively, committing crimes against the state. If Pavlik remained silent, he became complicit. If he acted, he would be fulfilling his duty as a conscious Soviet citizen. The ideology had an answer for every doubt, a counter-argument. For every hesitation, personal feelings were remnants of bourgeois sentimentality. The family was a tool of the old regime, used to perpetuate inequality and exploitation. True loyalty transcended blood. The revolution demanded sacrifice. The future belonged to those brave enough to break with the past. Over the following days, Pavlik gathered evidence. He noted the names of families his father had helped. He observed the times when documents were signed without proper verification. He listened to conversations, memorizing details. He was thorough, methodical, driven by a combination of ideological conviction, and perhaps something darker. The terrible clarity that comes when belief hardens into zealotry, when principle becomes more real than flesh. On September 3, 1932, 13-year-old Pavlik Morozov walked to the village Soviet building and asked to speak with the local OGPU representative, a man named Kartashov, who had been sent to oversee the grain collection campaign. What transpired in that conversation remains, in its precise details, lost to history. But the consequences were immediate and devastating. The arrest came at dawn, as such things usually did. 3 OGPU officers and a district party official arrived in Gerasimovka as the first light broke across the eastern horizon. They went directly to the Morozov household, their black automobile an ominous presence in a village where most transportation still involved horses or walking. Trofim Morozov was taken from his bed. His wife screamed. His younger son cried. Pavlik stood in the corner, pale but resolute, watching as his father was bound and led outside. Their eyes met for a moment, father and son, across an unbridgeable chasm of ideology and betrayal. What Trofim saw in his eldest son's face in that moment, whether recognition or incomprehension, whether anger or something more complicated, no record preserves. Tatyana turned on Pavlik, once the officers had gone, understanding immediately what had happened. "What have you done? What have you done to us?" The boy said nothing. His jaw was set, his hands clenched at his sides. He had done his duty. He had placed the interests of the collective above personal attachment. He had demonstrated the kind of revolutionary consciousness that separated the new Soviet man
from the backward peasant. The charges against Trofim Morozov were formally lodged within days. Counter-revolutionary sabotage, aiding kulak elements, falsifying official documents, obstructing the grain procurement campaign. The evidence included testimony from his own son, who had provided detailed accounts of his father's activities. In Stalin's Soviet Union, such evidence was more than sufficient. The outcome was never in doubt. Word of Pavlik's denunciation spread through the village like smoke from a fire. The reaction was complex, layered with fear and anger, and a kind of horrified disbelief. Some villagers, particularly the younger ones, indoctrinated in Soviet ideology, saw the boy as a hero, someone who had made the ultimate sacrifice for the cause. Others viewed him as something monstrous, an unnatural creature who had violated the most basic human bonds. In traditional Russian peasant culture, family loyalty was paramount. A son who betrayed his father was worse than a thief, worse than a murderer. He was someone who had torn the fabric of the natural order, who had committed an act that could never be forgiven or forgotten. The whispers began immediately. That Morozov boy, they said, he's cursed, he's damned himself. But there were other voices too, particularly among the party activists and young pioneers. Comrade Fyodorova praised Pavlik publicly, holding him up as an example to other students. "See what Pavel Morozov has done," she told the class. "He has shown us what it means to be a true pioneer. He has placed the revolution above personal interest. He has demonstrated the courage to fight class enemies wherever they hide." The local party newspaper published a brief article celebrating the boy's vigilance. District officials mentioned his name in reports sent up the chain of command. Pavlik Morozov was becoming something more than an individual. He was becoming a symbol, an exemplar, a teaching tool. Meanwhile, in a cell in the district OGPU headquarters, Trofim Morozov awaited his fate. The interrogations were brief and brutal. Soviet justice in 1932 did not concern itself over much with nuance or extenuating circumstances. The system required convictions to justify the terror, to maintain the illusion that the state's enemies were real and numerous and everywhere. Confession was preferred but not necessary. The testimony of informants, particularly young idealistic informants, carried considerable weight. Trofim was offered no opportunity to defend himself in any meaningful sense. No lawyer appeared on his behalf. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. The sentence was pronounced with the flat, bureaucratic efficiency that characterized Soviet legal proceedings: death by firing squad, to be carried out within 10 days. Tatyana Morozova was arrested separately on charges of complicity and failing to report counter-revolutionary activity. The younger Morozov son was sent to an orphanage, deemed too young to be an active participant in his father's crimes, but tainted nonetheless by association. Pavlik returned to school. He wore his red neckerchief. He participated in pioneer activities. He appeared, to outward observation, unchanged by the events he had set in motion. But the other children avoided him now. Even those who praised his actions publicly kept their distance. There was something about him that made people uncomfortable, something cold and certain that seemed inhuman in one so young. In late September, approximately 3 weeks after his arrest, Trofim Morozov was executed. The location was likely the grounds of the district OGPU facility, a place where many such sentences were carried out. His body was disposed of in an unmarked grave, as was standard practice. No ceremony marked his passing. No death certificate was issued to his family. He simply ceased to exist, transformed from person to non-person, from father to enemy of the state. Tatyana's fate followed shortly thereafter. Found guilty of the charges against her, she too faced the firing squad. The Soviet state showed no sentimentality toward the wives of condemned men. Mercy was a bourgeois concept, weakness in the face of class warfare. Pavlik Morozov, 13 years old, was now effectively an orphan. His parents dead by his own agency, his younger brother sent away, his home seized by the state. He had achieved perfect revolutionary consciousness. He had become the ideal young pioneer. and he had less than 2 months left to live. Autumn came to Gerasimovka in shades of gray and brown, the brief color of falling leaves quickly subdued by early frost. The grain collection campaign continued, though what was collected hardly justified the term harvest. The collective farm limped toward winter. Families huddled in their homes, conserving heat and hope in equal measure. Pavlik continued his routine, school, pioneer meetings, helping with farm work when required. But the atmosphere around him had changed. The initial praise from party activists had faded into uncomfortable silence. Even Comrade Fyodorova seemed unsure how to treat him now, oscillating between holding him up as an example and avoiding calling on him in class. The villagers' hostility was more obvious. Women crossed themselves when he passed, a superstitious gesture that persisted despite decades of anti-religious propaganda. Men looked away, children whispered and pointed. Pavlik was isolated, surrounded by people yet fundamentally alone. On November 3rd, he left the village in the company of his younger cousin, Danila, to gather cranberries in the forest. It was a common enough activity, a way to supplement meager diets with what nature provided. The forest lay perhaps a mile from the village, a mixed woodland of birch and pine that had stood for generations. What happened in those woods remains disputed in details, but clear in outcome. According to later Soviet accounts, Pavlik was attacked by Kulak sympathizers, seeking revenge for his denunciation of his father. The official narrative would identify his assailants as members of his own extended family, his uncle and cousin, men driven by backward peasant loyalty to murder the boy who had dared to place revolutionary duty above blood ties. The reality was likely more complicated, shaped by factors the official story would never acknowledge. The desperate anger of a community pushed beyond endurance, the ancient code of family honor violated, the specific horror of a child who had sent his own parents to their deaths, the sense that some fundamental boundary had been crossed and could only be answered with blood. Pavlik Morozov died in that forest, killed by multiple stab wounds. His cousin, Danila, 9 years old, was also murdered, likely because he was a witness. Their bodies were found the following morning, partially covered with leaves and forest debris, November frost already forming on their cold skin. The OGPU responded with the ruthless efficiency for which it was known. Within days, several villagers were arrested, including Pavlik's uncle, Arseny Kulukhanov, and his grandfather, Sergei Morozov. The investigation was swift and brutal. Confessions were extracted through methods that need not be detailed here, but can be imagined. The accused were charged with counter-revolutionary murder, with Kulak terrorism, with attempting to intimidate supporters of Soviet power. The trial took place in Tavda, the nearest town with a proper court facility. It was a public affair, designed to send a message. The defendants were paraded before a crowd of carefully selected observers, party activists, young pioneers, workers from local factories. The prosecution painted a picture of Kulak conspiracy, of class enemies striking back at the forces of progress, of brutal peasants murdering an innocent child whose only crime was his devotion to Soviet ideals. The defense was perfunctory, the outcome predetermined. On November 28, 1932, 1 year and 1 day after the opening scene of this narrative, Arseny Kulukhanov and Sergei Morozov were sentenced to death. 2 other defendants received lengthy prison terms. The sentences were carried out immediately. Thus ended the life of Pavlik Morozov, 13 years old, young pioneer, denouncer of his parents, victim of murder, and martyr in waiting for a propaganda machine that would transform his brief existence into myth. The Soviet state wasted no time in canonizing Pavlik Morozov. The boy who had betrayed his parents in the name of ideology was precisely the symbol Stalin's regime needed. The story had everything: youth, idealism, sacrifice, the triumph of new values over old, the necessity of placing the collective above the individual, the reality of class warfare even within families. In 1933, the writer Alexander Yakovlev published a fictionalized account of Pavlik's story in the Pioneer magazine. The article embellished details, simplified motivations, removed moral ambiguity. Pavlik became pure hero, his father pure villain, the murder pure martyrdom. The narrative spread through Soviet media with the coordinated efficiency of state propaganda.
Playwrights adapted the story for theater. Children across the USSR performed in productions glorifying Pavlik's actions. Poets wrote verses celebrating his sacrifice. Composers created songs about the boy martyr who had given everything for the revolution. Schools were renamed in his honor. Statues were erected. His image appeared on postage stamps, in textbooks, on pioneer propaganda posters. The cult of Pavlik Morozov served multiple functions for the Stalin regime. It reinforced the primacy of ideological loyalty over traditional bonds. It encouraged denunciation, making informing not just acceptable but heroic. It indoctrinated children into a worldview where the state's interests superseded all others. It provided a readily understandable narrative that justified the ongoing purges and the persecution of alleged enemies. Most importantly, it externalized the contradictions inherent in Stalin's policies. The famine killing millions in Ukraine could not be acknowledged as a consequence of forced collectivization and grain seizures. Instead, it had to be blamed on saboteurs and wreckers, on kulaks hiding grain, on counter-revolutionaries undermining Soviet power. Pavlik's story provided a human face for this narrative, a compelling drama that distracted from uncomfortable questions about the system itself. Throughout the 1930s and beyond, young pioneers learned about Pavlik Morozov as part of their political education. He became one of the few secular saints in the Soviet pantheon, a figure whose example was to be emulated. Generations of Soviet children were taught that his willingness to denounce his father represented the highest form of moral consciousness, that personal loyalty must always yield to political duty, that the family was less important than the party. The Great Terror of 1936 to 1938 saw Pavlik's example weaponized on a massive scale. Children were encouraged to inform on their parents, spouses denounced each other, friends betrayed friends. The atmosphere of surveillance and suspicion that characterized Stalinist society owed something to the mythology built around Gerasimovka's most famous son. After Stalin's death in 1953, the cult of Pavlik Morozov gradually diminished, but never entirely disappeared. Khrushchev's thaw brought some questioning of Stalinist excesses, but the pioneer organization continued to honor Pavlik's memory. The narrative persisted in a modified form through the Brezhnev era, the Andropov interregnum, the Chernenko years, a ghost of Stalinist ideology haunting Soviet education and propaganda. Only with Glasnost, in the late 1980s, did serious historical investigation begin to uncover the truth behind the legend. Researchers gained access to previously sealed archives. Survivors from Gerasimovka were interviewed. The gap between myth and reality became impossible to ignore. The real Pavel Morozov was not the unblemished hero of Soviet propaganda. He was a complicated figure, a child shaped by traumatic times, caught between conflicting loyalties, indoctrinated into an ideology that demanded the impossible. His father was not a kulak monster, but a village official trying to balance impossible demands with human compassion. The murder was not a clear-cut case of class warfare, but a tangled tragedy of family conflict, community anger, and desperation. But by then, the damage was done. For 60 years, millions of Soviet children had absorbed the lesson that Pavlik Morozov taught, that ideology trumps family, that denouncing loved ones is heroic, that there is no private sphere where the state's demands do not reach. The village of Gerasimovka no longer exists under that name. It was renamed and reconfigured during the Soviet era. Its identity subsumed into administrative reorganization. The house where the Morozov family lived is long gone, replaced or abandoned to the slow work of weather and time. The forest where Pavlik died still stands, though fewer people venture into its depths now. In modern Russia, Pavel Morozov's legacy remains contested. Some view him as a victim of Stalinist indoctrination, a child who cannot be blamed for the ideology forced upon him. Others see him as a symbol of the worst excesses of totalitarianism, a cautionary tale about what happens when the state demands absolute loyalty. Still others question whether the official story ever had much basis in fact, suggesting that the entire narrative was propaganda constructed around a kernel of truth. A monument to Pavlik stood in Moscow until recently.
though it was removed in the 1990s as Russia grappled with its Soviet past. Some monuments remain in other locations, aging and largely ignored. The Young Pioneer organization no longer exists. The ideology that created Pavlik Morozov's legend has been officially discarded, yet the questions his story raises remain urgent. What happens to a society that places ideology above family? What happens to children, raised to view their parents as potential enemies? What happens when the state demands not just obedience but emotional and moral totality, inserting itself into the most intimate human relationships? The 20th century provided many answers to these questions, most of them written in tragedy. The Soviet experiment in creating new forms of human consciousness, in demolishing traditional bonds in favor of revolutionary purity, produced millions of victims. Pavlik Morozov's parents were two among countless others, destroyed by a system that could not tolerate ambiguity, mercy, or the human impulse to protect one's own. The irony is that Pavel Morozov himself also became a victim of the very ideology he embraced. His denunciation of his father did not save him. His revolutionary consciousness did not protect him. His young pioneer neckerchief did not shield him from the violence that claimed his life in the November forest. He died at 13, having destroyed his family, and gained nothing but a few months of isolated existence before meeting his own end. The propaganda machine transformed him into an immortal hero, but that immortality was built on lies, simplifications, and the cynical manipulation of a child's death for political purposes. The real Pavel Morozov, whatever complexity and contradiction he embodied, was lost beneath layers of mythology, sacrificed not once but twice, first to ideology and then to the state's need for martyrs. As we look back across nearly a century to those events in Gerasimovka, we see not a simple story of good and evil, but a tragedy of human beings caught in historical forces beyond their control. We see a family destroyed. We see a community traumatized. We see children weaponized in service of an ideology that ultimately consumed them. The fields around what was once Gerasimovka are quieter now. The grain quotas are no longer enforced by secret police. The collective farms have been dissolved. The young pioneers have faded into history. But the lessons remain, etched in memory, preserved in documents, carried forward by those who understand that totalitarianism's greatest crime is not just the violence it inflicts on bodies, but the violence it does to bonds between human beings, to trust, to family, to the possibility of private loyalty in a public world. On a cold November day in 1932, a boy named Pavlik died in a forest near his village. He had lived 13 years. He had denounced his parents. He had believed in something larger than himself. And he had learned too late, if he learned it at all, that ideology without humanity is not salvation, but damnation. That purity purchased with betrayal is the most corrupt bargain of all. The story of how a Soviet boy got his parents executed is ultimately not a story about heroism or villainy. It is a story about what happens when ideology demands everything, when the state inserts itself into the family, when children are taught to place abstraction above love. It is a warning written in graves, echoing across time, reminding us that the bonds between parents and children, for all their imperfections, are among the most fundamental aspects of our humanity, and that any system seeking to sever those bonds will ultimately destroy not just families but itself. The dawn that broke over Gerasimovka, that November morning in 1932, revealed a world transformed by violence and ideology. Nearly a century later, we can still learn from its cold light, still hear the warning it carries, still understand the cost of placing faith in systems that promise utopia, while demanding the sacrifice of everything human in its pursuit. In the end, there were no winners in this tragedy, only victims, casualties of a historical moment when the future devoured the past, when children turned on parents, when villages became battlegrounds in a war that never ended, because it was fought inside the human soul, and the forests remember, even when we forget.